Good morning. I'm Sigantha Nathaniel. I'm the Director of Industry Development at Manitoba Agriculture. Our next session is on the role of businesses in building sustainable protein food systems. So we're excited to have Melanie Levine from the World Business Council of Sustainable Development to speak to this topic. Melanie is the Manager of Food and Agriculture in the organization. As part of her role, she works closely with agribusinesses across the value chain on food systems transformation. Melanie has recently located to Chicago from Singapore. While she was in Singapore, she served as a committee member with Women in Agribusiness Asia. She has previously worked with the World Food Programme in Cambodia with the United Nations, the FAO, the World Cocoa Foundation, and Dexis Consulting Group. With such extensive expertise in food systems, I'm very excited to hear Melanie's take on how businesses in Manitoba can build sustainable protein food systems. Before we get started, I want to mention that this session is pre-recorded. We have a chat box on the right corner of the screen where Melanie will respond to your questions in real time. Over to you, Melanie.
Thanks so much. Let me go ahead and share my screen with the slides that I've prepared for this session. All right, hopefully you can see those. Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today on how the private sector is acting to drive a sustainable food systems transformation with a focus on proteins. As introduced, I'm Melanie Levine, and I manage food and agriculture programs at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, or by its acronym WBCSD. I collaborate with dozens of global companies and a network of multi-sector partners on initiatives to create a more sustainable food system. And my entry point into this has always been equity, affordable, quality, and healthy food for all people with a focus on livelihoods for agricultural workers. Here, let me move on to the next slide. There we go. As many of you likely agree, given your vantage point from the protein space, the world is suddenly paying attention to food systems, which is amazing, but the stakes are so high because humanity's future, as we all know, depends on its ability to create a food system that supports healthy people and a healthy planet. And WBCSD is helping to facilitate corporate action towards those goals. However, the current food systems as they currently stand are outstripping the planet's resources, while diets are resulting in overnutrition and undernutrition for people worldwide, resulting in health crises. And of course, there are close links to what's been going on with the COVID-19 pandemic, which we're still mired in today. So on this slide are just a few stats around greenhouse gas emissions, land degradation, food security. But honestly, this entire slide deck could be filled with statistics alone. So much alarming evidence related to the food system's impacts on water use, biodiversity, nature, and more. And continuing population growth and changes in dietary habits will only amplify these crises, as we know. Many major scientific and economic reports from credible institutions like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the World Resources Institute are sounding the alarm that we need to act today. And of course, that makes space for the private sector's activities. The private sector is operating in a fast-changing landscape, though. Media attention has shown a spotlight on the food system, including stories on slave labor and supply chain, mistreatment of animals, irresponsible resource use, illegal deforestation, and commodity supply chains. And this has led to increased consumer awareness and public opinion on how food is produced and consumed. Through technology, we have more information than ever on global supply chains through increased traceability with implications for the private sector. Consumers are demanding transparency about the origin of products, and businesses are being held accountable more than ever before. Some consumers are leveraging their purchasing power to push for change. Also on this slide, businesses navigating an evolving regulatory landscape, I'm sure in Manitoba, Canada, and the broader North American context, including changing laws around product labeling, eco-labeling, deforestation, labor rights, and more. And people are becoming wealthier in a lot of geographies, and demand for product portfolios are evolving. In some places, this means access to more nutrients like protein, but it can also lead to consumption of unhealthy foods. Vegetarian and vegan diets are gaining traction, and the business community is seeing growing commercial opportunity within this framework. As I said, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown a spotlight on the need for more resilience in our food system as a whole. It brought to light bottlenecks in trade, issues around critical migrant farm labor, sanitation conditions in factories, and the fact that we rely on food systems workers as essential workers, which I don't think was kind of brought to the foray in the conversation before. The pandemic also lifted the importance of diet, as obesity and other diet-related conditions contributed to worse health outcomes for people who contracted the virus. And lastly, businesses are seeing the impacts of climate change and social tensions on operations and are growing to recognize that to stay afloat, they must change. Water isn't readily available, temperature patterns are shifting, and there's a greater push for pay equity, and businesses need to navigate that changing landscape. So this is just sort of highlighting how the private sector is seeing the framework in which they're working. And how can they navigate that? Well, it's within the context that WBCSD is working with its 200 plus member companies to achieve our critical vision, a world where by 2050, over 9 billion people are all living well and within planetary boundaries. We're doing this by helping our member companies improve their individual sustainability performance, number one. Number two, acting collectively to carry out interventions at scale, and we could talk about some of those multi-sector actions later on today. And working across sectors to change the very systems upon which we rely through partnerships with the UN and the NGO sector, which are critical to this effort because the private sector really cannot do this alone. And we won't achieve the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, or the Paris Climate Change Agreement without fixing food systems. Given that the private sector is responsible for the production and sale of almost all food consumed globally, business has a huge opportunity to contribute. To help guide the sector, WBCSD has launched the CEO Guide for Food Systems Transformation, as you can see here visualized on this slide, which lays out 7 pathways for change and offers a call to action for all business leaders. And accompanying this guiding document, there are food and agriculture sector roadmap chapters that dive into each of these pathways with more granularity, offering specific levers and goals for businesses to take forward. So I'd encourage you, if you have time after this session, to take a look at those documents, which are available on our website. So most of what I've just shared speaks to the food system as a whole, but why does sustainable protein have such an important role? As we know, because we're all here today working in the space, proteins are at the heart of debates within the food system because of their environmental impacts and because of the continuing debate about how best to balance them in human diets. As we know, protein production has massive impacts on greenhouse gas emissions, land use, and water use. But as visualized in this slide, it's super important to recognize that animal proteins show high variability in terms of their environmental impacts. This variability corresponds to a variety of practices that offer opportunities for more sustainable management. For example, the potential for grazing systems to sequester carbon, or the ecosystem services offered by certain production systems. And our roadmap goes into some of these opportunities if you have the opportunity to look at it. However, we can't deny it's true that animal-based foods tend to have higher environmental impacts than plant-based foods. So rebalancing diets with more plant-based foods, especially in countries dominated by Western diets where animal proteins are overconsumed, provides an opportunity to reduce these emissions, the amount of land required for agriculture, natural resource consumption, chemical input use, and biodiversity loss. So lots of opportunity there. Here on this slide, it demonstrates that it's important to mention that in places like Europe and North America, the context in which we're operating and convening today, an increasing number of developing regions, people consume more protein than biologically necessary, and a critical health objective to reach adequate protein intake in terms of quantity and quality for everyone, while rebalancing animal and plant protein consumption is what many of the companies that I work with are focusing on. All right, moving on to this slide, which shows the solution spaces that we've prioritized within our protein pathways paper. So the realization of this opportunity to rebalance diets, both using animal and plant-based proteins, will require both farm level and system level interventions. And in the protein pathways paper that we've published, the top 6 most impactful solutions have been identified for business to act based on each intervention's calculated impacts related to greenhouse gas emissions and supporting biodiversity, and they're listed here. And the private sector, more than any other sector, has so many strengths to bring to these solution spaces. R&D teams, for example, can innovate around new protein products that are healthy and sustainable. The finance sector has a role to play, making investments that can be linked to ESG related outcomes, and we're already seeing this growing trend. The industry also knows consumer behavior best and can test what works with buyers and what's most likely to succeed in the market. So business is well placed within the system to lead on these efforts, and diversifying the protein supply is estimated to be able to generate business opportunity of a value of $240 billion by 2030 globally. And we're seeing so many strong examples of company action to take advantage of this transformational opportunity. Some include fields used to maintain or increase soil carbon, reformulating feeds, increasing grass-fed livestock where grain feed is currently used, optimizing breed diversity for environmental compatibility and ecosystem services tailored and customized to specific regions, and encouraging circular production. So getting creative in terms of byproduct reuse, which is really critical. So in the WBCSD Food and Agriculture Roadmap chapter on sustainable and healthy diets, we highlight case studies from companies that are leading on the responsible protein agenda to elevate lessons learned and also barriers in this space so that we can all learn together. Here you can see some of these examples. For example, how Simrise is innovating to valorize chicken byproducts and other offerings using their no waste program. Others come from Kellogg's, Evonik, DSM, Nestle, all across the entire value chain. There's opportunity for action. And highlighted here is Maple Leaf, whose CEO we heard from earlier in the conference and is one of the largest plant-based protein producers in North America, in fact. Their subsidiary, Greenleaf Foods, owns plant-based brands that do very well. This case study, though, looked specifically at the innovation around the 50/50 line of products, which is geared towards flexitarian customers and is a strong example of companies innovating to develop a product portfolio that serves a shifting consumer base. And I'll also say that knowledge sharing and peer learning is really key to how we act at WBCSD. Companies can't do this in isolation, and offering these examples shares opportunities to lift all companies that are aiming to shift their own practices. And if you have any questions about these, you're more than welcome to reach out to us. All right, moving on to the next slide. So in our protein transformation paper, we lay out a call for action for companies. Action towards defining your company's role in the food system and identifying interventions within your scope of influence. Setting targets is really key, and especially that those targets reflect the true value of externalities and look at risks and materialities for the whole business, including supply chains, and defining areas for improvement. This is one of the first steps that companies should take. The next is reporting on annual progress, making public commitments, and driving policy change by bringing a global voice, hopefully at the C-suite level, to global convenings as an advocate for food systems transformation. So that transparency is really critical. And also informing emerging frameworks and certification schemes is key. We need to make sure that certification schemes as they arise, especially out of government, are reflective of what companies can do and what they see as a good business opportunity. And WBCSD helps to unify the private sector and feed into the development of a lot of these guiding frameworks. All right, moving on to the next slide. How does the business community act collectively to impact at scale? So the pre-competitive collaboration is WBCSD's sweet spot. And I can share some of the ways that we've worked with global companies, in particular the FRESH project, which is one of the projects that I'm a manager in, facilitates the development and piloting of business solutions, improving the production and consumption of a diversity of proteins. And we see this approach as twofold. One, the need to improve the sustainability performance of animal-based proteins, while number two, simultaneously expanding healthy and sustainable alternatives to animal protein sources. And I'm proud to share a handful of examples of our work with you, which has been driven by member companies' needs and aligned with the multi-sector global food systems transformation agenda and outcomes from key convenings like the UN Food Systems Summit, which are really critical in setting our path forward to 2050. First, as pictured here, the Protein Impact Framework, which offers businesses the opportunity to make balanced assessments of the sustainability and health impacts of different protein products and production methods, taking into account a holistic set of assessments, as you can see on the right, such as environmental, societal, health, and business issues that are useful to members in their decision-making and product development. And this Protein Impact Framework is available online if you're interested in looking at it further. Another couple of examples. Members came together to develop and sign the Responsible Business Pledge for Better Nutrition, which was released alongside the Nutrition for Growth Summit in Tokyo, and highlights smart commitments across the categories of nutrition, smart agriculture, product reformulation, and reformulation for improved nutrition, business model innovation, responsible marketing, promoting healthy eating, workforce nutrition, and finance and investment opportunities for improved nutrition. So really looking at this holistically and encouraging companies to step forward and make ambitious commitments. In addition, our member companies are working together to participate in workshops and research using the Center for Behavior and the Environment's methodology called the RARE Framework for Consumer Behavior Change Interventions. This is something I'm leading now in our Plant Forward space, and we also have companies working on consumer behavior change interventions in our Responsible Meat initiative. Companies are pooling information related to how to nudge consumers towards better meat and plant-forward protein options. So they're learning together within a framework that's been established as one of the leading frameworks for understanding how consumers make decisions and how companies can help drive those towards sustainable and healthy diets. And the last example I'll give is WBCSD's initiative called the True Value of Food, which is helping to guide business leaders and the finance sector in accounting for the real value of food in their decisions and in their actions. This recent paper pictured here on the slide is part of a broader initiative that distills knowledge from interviews with leading member companies like Bayer, Danone, DSM, Nestle, OCP Group, Olam, Rabobank, and Syngenta, many of which are probably business partners of yours or you've seen sort of acting within this food systems transformation space. And this work helps companies identify their direct and indirect natural, social, and economic impacts of a food product from farm to fork. So I want to just wrap up today by thanking you again for inviting me to join this important convening and sharing some of the ways that WBCSD's member companies are acting collectively to make food systems transformation more sustainable with a focus on protein. And if you want to get in touch, my contact information is here on this slide. We love to collaborate with you. So I'll stop sharing my slide deck now. We can move to questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Melanie. It's great to hear your insights on how the World Business Council for Sustainable Development works with businesses on solutions to address sustainability issues. I also like the fact that you touched on the importance of the balance between plant and meat protein. That's something that's very important to us here in Manitoba. So currently, we're hearing more and more about inflation. We're hearing about supply chain challenges, and we're also hearing about people facing challenges with the affordability of food and nutrition. I'd be interested to hear about your perspective on how businesses can address these important social implications like food affordability, and how are these issues impacted by changes in the value chain?
Thanks so much for that question. It's a really important one. As I mentioned from the outset, equity and food security is actually the kind of entry point that I had professionally into this space, and it's really critical. I think it's important for our member companies to also recognize that food affordability doesn't just mean driving prices of food down and making them as cheap as possible for consumers, because we have to recognize that once we start accounting for the true value of food, sort of balancing all the social and environmental externalities, we actually undervalue food globally, and food is cheaper in terms of its price than is actually reflected in the true value and the true impact of the production cycle. So I think there are a lot of creative ways that companies can look at food affordability. I think reformulation, thinking about what makes a food product most healthy and beneficial for consumers and how to make sure that that's reflected in what's sold on product shelves. I think thinking about the entire value chain, including farmers, those at the kind of upper ends of the supply chain, and living incomes and wages, and is food affordable for the people that are actually growing it? And that takes a systems approach. And I think that's where WBCSD recognizes that the private sector cannot tackle these challenges alone. It comes down to social services, it comes down to minimum wage standards, and how do we ensure that people all over the world can afford a healthy and sustainable diet. So it's not just necessarily about food prices, although prices must reflect the true value of the impact of the production cycle, but also about ensuring that wages are higher and that people have a broader quality of life standard that enables them to buy food in an affordable way. So there are lots of I guess, intersecting elements that are going to be explored in a paper that we're putting out on food affordability later this year. So stay tuned for that, and I can circulate it to the organizers of this conference so it trickles down to everybody who's joining today. There will be good insights.
Thanks, Melanie. You bring up a good point that we cannot tackle this alone. We know that businesses, producers, government, and the research community, we all have a part to play in this sustainability story. And in Manitoba, we know the importance of working together. From your perspective, are there success stories that you can speak to where businesses have worked well across the value chain and with the research community and government on solutions to address sustainability issues?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many examples of good collaboration across the value chain and across sectors. One that's at front of mind for me comes out of a UN convening that happened at the end of last year called the UN Food Systems Summit. And it really aimed to bring stakeholders across the entire food systems together to highlight some of the key challenges and establish working groups and actions out of those working groups that could carry forward into the subsequent year. So now we're in that action phase. One of the coalitions that I'm thinking of, because I'm involved in it, is the Coalition on Decent Work and Living Incomes and Wages, which is a multi-sector coalition bringing together groups like the Farmer Income Lab, like EFAD, like the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and companies through the representation of WBCSD and companies that have stepped up independently to participate. So one of the areas of action is to do a benchmarking analysis of what farmer incomes look like worldwide across specific value chains and geographies, and identifying hotspots where there needs to be intervention, such as diversification of income schemes, such as greater access to things like daycare, so that children aren't working on farms and parents can access the living, income that they need in certain geographies. And so identifying solutions collectively around the specific issue of living incomes within that global framework is really key. And it will also come down to government regulation around living wages. And so business has a big role to play there as an off-taker of a lot of the commodities that are grown by small farmers in many places around the world. So that would just be one collaboration that I can think of right now.
Those are some great points. We're also hearing that sustainability has become the cost of doing businesses. And you just mentioned that businesses need to step up when it comes to sustainability. Today, we're seeing employees choosing to join companies because of their ambitions of becoming a net zero company and their vision on sustainability. My question to you is, how can food businesses differentiate themselves from other businesses using sustainability as a competitive advantage?
I love that point about people choosing to work for companies that are viewed as sustainability leaders, because it's definitely something that maybe doesn't come up enough, but is really key, especially in the new way of working with remote work. People have more flexibility in terms of what companies they can work for and where they can work for those companies. And there's been a lot of shift in the job market, and people are thinking about how their values are reflected in the company's values. And so I think it's really important that that comes from the top, first of all. The CEO or the C-suite executives need to be championing sustainability impacts, and it can't come from the bottom up. So I guess that's one. I think transparency and communication with customers is also key. There are a lot of companies that are doing really good work innovating in the sustainability space, but aren't necessarily sharing those successes as directly as they could. So I think communications around sustainability is really important so that customers can make that decision using their purchasing power that can result in improved revenues for companies as a result of that kind of leading action that's been taken. And also connections with retailers or kind of buyers is key. Buyers are also thinking about where the food that they buy comes from and sort of the chain all the way up the value chain. And so using that as a differentiating factor, if you're sitting in the middle of the value chain and you're more B2B than B2C, so to speak, is also potentially a competitive advantage for some of the leading retailers. So being clear about that in the way that you interact with buyers, I think can really set companies apart as well.
You bring up a really good point there on communication. Now, there's also that concern from businesses and producers that when you adopt practices to address sustainability, it can have that negative impact on profitability. How can we shift this perspective? How can businesses go about encouraging players across the value chain to adopt sustainable practices?
Yeah. It's a good question, and it comes up quite a bit as we talk about shifting business models. I think the first is using the true value of food framework to think about how, I guess, what the value is of a food product or the broader product portfolio looks like for companies, and making sure that that's reflected in how you do business. So that's one, and that may change the sort of trade-offs that are made in terms of business decision making. I would say leveraging finance could be a good opportunity for companies that are thinking this may take a cut into profitability. Well, there are a lot of kind of finance facilities emerging that are giving companies the opportunity to innovate around sustainable products that they may not have had the financing to innovate for before. So there could be good business opportunities. And I think I quoted one of the statistics around the many billions of dollars of business opportunity that can be identified when we're thinking in this food systems transformation framework. And so, marketing to a growing consumer base of people that want to put their dollar where their values are could also help boost productivity in specific portfolios that companies hadn't previously prioritized. So I think there are lots of potential benefits. Of course, it's different for every company, but the opportunities are emerging as companies speak up about the importance of this agenda, and that we bring in the investor sector as well.
That's great. Thanks, Melanie. We have very quickly run out of time. That brings us to the end of this session. It's been a fantastic opportunity to hear from you and the work of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Really appreciate you taking the time to present at our 2022 Protein Summit. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.